118th day of class, Introduction to Imperialism. And before we move forward with imperialism, I want to take a quick look back at the other three portions of this unit age of revolutions. And hopefully by now you recall how nations came into being, the 8-part formula to be a nation. We've made our own country. Hopefully that's stuck in your head by now. Second part, political revolutions. I'm hoping you know the story of how the United States, Japan, Haiti, Italy, Mexico, and France came into being. And then industrialism, how we shifted from feudalism and agrarian economies into industrial factory economies and how it affected this area. And then the fourth part, imperialism. And before we get into the history of imperialism, I'm going to pose to you a philosophical question. What was the worst instance of bullying you've ever observed? Now, in bullying, there are some people that emerge from bullying, whether it's serious or not. And the first role is perpetrator. Now, this is the person who actually did the bullying. And oftentimes they lack something. They have power over their victims. They feel a sense of superiority over their victims. And they rationalize and justify their behaviors. These aren't people who will say, yes, I'm doing something wrong. They rationalize, they justify. Now, group number 2 is a bystander. A bystander is somebody who watches the injustice take place. And there's a time and a place out of self-preservation, you might not get involved, but they might not get involved out of apathy or fear, but they're watching the injustice take place and not doing anything. And then there's the victims. Now, the victims are oppressed by the perpetrators. They feel powerless. They feel vulnerable. They're often different than the perpetrators and provide something the perpetrator needs or wants. And there's also a role called the rescuer. This is the person who gets involved and tries to remedy the injustice. That doesn't really apply to the imperialism analogy, but I will say 2 parts certainly do. Perpetrator and victim. There were certain nations that lacked something. Raw materials, labor force, that kind of thing. They had superiority over their victims in a military fashion. They had a philosophical sense of superiority over them, and they rationalized and justified what they did. And then there was the people on the bad end of that stick who were getting oppressed by these people. So what is imperialism, if I'm going to use the standard definition here? And if you were to Google the term imperialism, you might come up with a definition stating imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. Another definition you might come across would state that imperialism occurs when a strong nation takes over a weaker nation or region and dominates its economic, political, or cultural life. The second definition might conjure up thoughts of colonization, and that's good, because a major aspect of imperialism involves the taking of colonies. In this assignment, you will explore the concept of imperialism, and at the end, I would like you to come up with your own definition of imperialism based upon what it means to you and how it affects the world today. So that was the assignment, and here are the sources we used. Now, if you look at the bottom, these were the 12 nations that were engaged in imperialism. And you can see 9 of them are European, 2 of them have European roots, the United States and Russia. The only non-European imperial nation was Japan. And who are they taking over now? On this big map, I'm seeing Africa, and I'm seeing the Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. And here's a different scale. Now, if you look at the continent of Africa, 94% of the continent was taken over by imperial powers, and you can see these. Here's China and Asia. You can see big portions of that nation being taken over by imperial powers. Now, here's some other sources we looked at. A poem. Now, there's a poem called Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, and he created some fantastic children's book, The Jungle Book, old Disney movie. However, he is known as the poet of imperialism. And if you look at his children's book, he's beloved. If you look at his sentiments from imperialism, he's probably quite the opposite. And I took some portions of this poem, White Man's Burden. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' needs. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. by open speech and simple and 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go mark them with your living, and mark them with your dead. So this is a poem, White Man's Burden. And then another source we looked at were 3 quotes by people from all over the world. And here's EB Dubois, and he said, "What do nations care about the cost of war if by spending a few hundred millions in steel and gunpowder they can gain 1,000 millions in diamonds and cocoa?" And Sukarno wrote, "I hate imperialism, I detest colonialism, and I fear the consequences of their last bitter struggle for life. We are determined that our nation, and the world as a whole, shall not be the plaything of one small corner of the world." And then Said wrote, "Every empire, however, tells itself and the world that it's unlike all other empires, that its mission is not to plunder and control, but to educate and liberate." Now, 3 men, same sentiment, different sentiment. We'll get into that. And then the last source we looked at, this is the world in 1995. It's a little bit dated, but modern enough. The size of the world based on GDP. Now, GDP is the amount of money a country makes. I make a salary, a nation makes a GDP. Now, if you're looking at the big hitters here, the United States, France, England, Germany, Italy, Spain, Japan, South Korea. Now, some of these nations don't exist. If you're using economics for size, some have gone blank. So, why is that? Here's a little more modern. This is 2007. The cool colors, the blues and greens, means you have a lot of dough, a lot of GDP. And the warmer colors, the oranges and reds and blacks here, means you don't have very much. Okay, so these were the sources we used. Now here were the questions. Question number 1. From what part of the world did imperial colonial powers come from? And number 2, what regions, continents were being colonized? So if I go back here to the beginning, the parts of the world where imperial powers were coming from were European. And the people they colonized, Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, Southeast Asia. So going back to here, question 1. What part of the world did imperial colonial powers come from? Primarily Europe, Japan, Russia, and America, but primarily European. What regions and continents were colonized? Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, Southeast Asia. Then we brainstormed. What advantages did the imperial powers have over those being colonized? Good conversations, but it really boiled down to 3 big things. You had a really good boat to get there. You had a really good weapon to put people in their place. And number 3, you had a lot of money to buy the boats and the tools and the soldiers and all those sorts of things. So those are the 3 biggies we came up with for number 3. Now, question number 4. How did you see racism and social Darwinism at work in imperialism? Now, you might not know what social Darwinism means, but it's a belief, it's a way of thinking of survival of the fittest, but for people. Now, in biology class, it's kind of a no-brainer. You watch these videos and you watch the male, elk beat the daylights out of each other till one elk emerges, the big, strong elk, and he hops on the girl elks and makes stronger little baby elks. That's biology's version of Darwinism in a sense. But social Darwinism is this notion that survival of the fittest. And if you look back at this, European nations took over people of color. Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. And then, but you ask them, hey, why is that? Hey, survival of the fittest. We're better, we're superior, and tough skadoodles for everybody else. So clearly you don't see any white-on-white imperialism. What you see are white people colonizing people of color. So there's significant racism that's entrenched in imperialism. Now, number 5, the central message of Kipling's poem. And he's justifying what they are doing. And he's saying, these people without us are, I think this sums it up right here, half devil and half child. These people are not civilized. They're not capable of running themselves very well. They're at a lower level of civilization. We have to help these people out. We have to bring our level of civilization to them. By the way, the people there didn't want it, but he's saying this. So generally when people are doing things in the sense of the perpetrator in this case, you justify it, you rationalize it. So that would be number 5. Now for number 6, those 3 quotes, here, let's look at these. These people are not liking imperialism. Okay, it's hurting people for economic gain. I detest colonialism. We're not a plaything. His people being used as a plaything, being demeaned into an afterthought for a powerful nation. He hates it. This is very clear. I hate imperialism. And Said is saying people justify it and say, for whatever odd reason, we're bringing education, we're bringing infrastructure, we're liberating the people, this, that, and the other thing. At the core, all 3 of these men are saying imperialism is very bad and has to go. Now, in terms of number 7, it's real easy. If you look at this world, old imperial nations still have a lot of money. Old colonies still have a little money. It's that simple. Okay? You can look at the areas of the world where they were colonized. It's not very economically strong compared to the big industrial countries. Okay? And the last question. How would you define imperialism? In what ways does the practice of imperialism affect the world today? Now, I'm going to let you figure that one out. I'm going to let you answer that one on your own. But hopefully you have the gist of imperialism. And as we move forward, we're going to go into more detail. How it affected Africa, how it affected the Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. And then we're going to wrap it up, and we will be done with Unit 4. So, thank you for watching.